The events of the past several days have been both shaken my understanding of the world and left me with a disheartened and perplexed disposition. Yet, I feel that I must organize these events in my mind, that I'm about to compel the structure, the terrible things to which I have seen, so that I may understand them better. So that my mind may be at rest, a need to quantify just what took place. It was entirely by an accident when I met one John R. It was spring, and the early occurrences were faring against well of a dozen last frozen constraints of the winter's grip. I was researching an article I was writing for a publication to which it was, shall we say, less than repugnant, when I found myself at the mercy of a small highland village of the evening. The whole ordeal was frustrating and tiresome to say the least. I was supposed to be back on Glasgow that night to type up my notes and brush off the fog that often accompanied with my writing assignments. Being stranded in a tiny village with one street and a pub in which it looked like it hadn't been decorated since the Dark Ages, was not my ideal of home comfort, but especially after a few weeks of constrained travel, interminable interviews, and more restless nights in a dingy bed and breakfast. There had been a small substance down one town over, the one that had just made it impossible for the local bus to continue onward, and more importantly to me, carry me to safety. Following the several phone calls as I attempted to procure alternative travel arrangements, it became apparent that I was going nowhere until morning. The sleepy pub inn was, which was affectionately entitled as the Laird of Dungorf, looking like it would fall down on top of me at any moment, complete as it was warped with wooden rafters and clenting, to which it appeared to be as creaky, would have to be my home for the night. After speaking to the owner, a tall, peaked man in his 50s, I was kindly given a small room upstairs, to which clearly hadn't been slept in or cleaned for some time. Still, the people were nice to me enough, and after some basic, enjoyable local food, I sat in my cozy armchair by an old open fire in the bar, deciding to kill the boredom with a few pints of local beer and a bottle of wine. The flames danced around before me as the evening drew and the numbing of the alcohol took effect. I actually was quite confident. I almost glad to be in such a rustic surroundings. The village may have been somewhat bleak, but against the cold winds outside of the darkening sky, the inn was without the charm. I am not sure how long he had been sitting there, hypnotized as I was by the heat, underneath the mantelpiece and a few glasses of red, but it still came apparent as I had joined by another guest at the inn. He sat across from me in the broad frayed armchair on the other side of the fireplace, sat there gazing at the flickering flames. He was curious in disposition, and outwardly he appeared to be relatively young, probably in his early 30s, but his persona was swamped in fragility to which it would normally not expect to see a man of his age. His face glowed in firelight, and lighting thing carrying with it worries lines which betrayed the inner turmoil. His eyes defocused, glazed over, and his hands trembling slightly as he warmed them by the burning embers. "Is there a problem?" I heard the words, but I could not register them until they were repeated. "Excuse me, is there a problem?" The man addressed me in a sharp manner, and I was taken aback by the realization that I had been staring at him for several minutes. "No, not at all," I answered apologetically. I I thought I recognized you." He then turned his face to me, and he displayed his expression with the look of disbelief at my obvious lie, but thankfully without any small vestige of good humor. "I apologize if there was a little abrupt with you," he said. "It's just that I am sick and tired of people staring at me around here." He raised his voice at the conclusion of his sentence and cast a wide-eye around the pub for a few scattered drinkers and lurkers who populated it. I sensed that those present wished to avoid his gaze. When we diverted into an hour or so of a small talk, his name was John R., and he was land acquirement for the agent from London. He claimed to be appraising the location nearby, which a local farmer was willing to sell off property to developers. But I immediately sensed that he was not comfortable with speaking about his work. In fact, he quickly changed the focus on the conversation on me entirely. My job, life, family, anything. It was as if he needed to exchange our changes to continue, an obvious failed attempt to keep his mind distracted from a hidden anxiety. Each time I attempt to ask a question about him or his life, he would either provide one or two answers or ignore them altogether, moving quickly into a question of his own. Finally, the conversation ran its course, as they often do, with only one real participant. And for the moment, we sat there in relative silence, the only sounds coming from a few locals propping up the bar and occasional clink of empty glasses being washed and cleaned by the owner. The pub was now noticeably dimmer, with almost the light being provided with a few small overhead lights, and the fire to which it continued to crackle and flicker all evening. I turned to one of the windows outside, seeing nothing but darkness. Then the words just escaped from my mouth, without much thought or effort. Why would people be staring at you, John? There was a long pause as I looked at him while waiting for an answer, his eyes trained to the floor, but his face itched in worry. I expected no in-depth response, given the curtiness of his previous conversation, and so he continued drinking my wine when he suddenly replied in a somber tone, "They all know, but they don't have the courage to speak about it." Turning to the few fellow drinkers still in the pub, he had then shouted, "They're all afraid!" The response from the landlord and his patrons were unusually muted. They seemed to ignore John's accusation entirely. With only the briefest hesitation or movement would conversation of proof that they had actually heard the outburst at all. I did not expect such a very volatile response, but there was desperation in that shout, anger, and frustration. Then, looking directly at me, what I can describe as a mixture of fear and heartbreak, he opened his mouth as if to speak again. Before hesitating once more, I sensed that the man deep down wished to finally relieve himself of a burden, as if some toxic piece of information was boring to his very soul. As a writer, my curiosity was captivated by the possibility of an unfurling tale. Perhaps maybe I could use one as a basis for the future article or story. Anticipating on how he required even the slightest push to confide in me, I leaned over and whispered, "What is all that?" It filled with conflicting sentiment. I could feel what is about to become privy to something important. Yet by his trembling and obnoxious demeanor, I dreaded what something might be. Another moment passed, and it was as if the room had fallen under a shadow of palpable silence. Those nearby listening from the tenebrous and uninviting corners. Then he spoke. "If you'd be kind enough to share your wine with me, I'll be glad to tell you," he said softly. He did not have to say twice. I rose out of my chair and asked at the bar for a second bottle and a glass to share with my companion. There was a particular hesitancy as the landlord picked up from both from the shelf behind him, placing the two in front of me. As I returned to my seat, I know those present were now watching me, and I felt as if my bones were there, as something uncomfortably stifling about their looks, and shadowed accusatory glances, steeped in the fear. I poured the glasses of wine, to which John drank and one of the gluttonous gulp. A sight I knew was a man of drowning melancholy, which burns inside. After pouring him another, I sat the bottle between us, waiting for him to tell his story. After looking down not from his drink for a moment, he raised his head, staring intently at me as the fire cracked and burned, but as if exorcising a burden from his soul. He began. John had intentionally intended on spending no more than a few days in the village, even after traveling all day from London, and the evening had bringing with a bite of the Scottish winter. He intended to get started as quickly as possible. The quicker he was to finish, the quicker he'd be home. Working for the large property acquisition firm, it was his job to facilitate rich clients in their pursuit of land to which they built on. The individual he was representing at the time was especially interested in buying some farmland with a beautiful country view, where they wished to build a large holiday home to their family. The location in question had been recently put on the market by a local farmer who had fallen onto the difficult times as the economy wilted. John was there before hire to evaluate the land and negotiate the price based on the recommendations made by the group of surveyors who have been there the previous week. After checking the Laird of Dungworth, he drove his car to the farm, which was only a few miles outside of the village. An eerie area consists of large sprawling fields where crops were grown and animals grazed, a few patches of woodland, and the occasional river or bubbling stream. The negotiations were relatively simple. The farmer, an elderly man by the name of Dale, needed the injection of money as soon as possible to keep the rest of the farm on its feet. While buying, the client was enthusiastic about the potential purchase and wished to conclude the deal quickly. Regardless, John was always very careful about financing the deal before he himself had taken a look at the land. Over the years, he had developed a reputation for delivering exactly what the client wanted. Without any nasty surprises, after this procurement, such as the land subsides or another planning difficulties, although he didn't much enjoy the groundwork of surveying, he was well qualified about the spot if anything, which might cause difficulties at the later date. But despite this fruity attitude, he was still hopped back into the city, and perhaps soon as the next day, all things will be well. The farmer, Mr. Dale, graciously agreed to take him out by the land by the tractor, and it was not without a slight feeling of remorse that John listened to the old man describing the history of the area, his family attachment to build it, to which was why it was so important for him to keep the place going. But business was business, and the money Dale would make on the two fields, would provide him with a substantial windfall, hopefully enough to keep the weather in the financial storm. Night approached quickly, and John was delighted at the bumpy, uncomfortable drive, but it did not take long. After the short time, Dale stopped the tractor and pointed at the two adjacent fields that he was selling. For the next half hour, John sloshed around through the mud and grass in his boots, taking photographs where his clients were thinking of building. While the pursuing of the surveyor's team notes, comparing them with his own observations, Dale did not wish to accompany him by the survey, and did not stood to the side of the gravel path, watching forlornly. Finally, John had finished, but just as he did so, all of his eyes were drawn to a hill a few miles away, one which looked over the entire area. It appeared to be inhabited, one which looked like patches of woodland and grass being only distinguishing features. Despite its distance, the hills seemed to have dominated the horizon. Even without verbalizing, he felt as if it was special or unique somehow. On returning to the tractor, he pointed it out, but Dale seemed unwillingly to talk about that particular subject, answering any questions pertaining to it with an icy silence. It was John's job to keep the portfolio of the land, to which he thought clients may have been interested in it, and what they wanted to look like with the beautiful view of the countryside. It would be something worth appraising for the development, especially for such a rich business person in love with the Scottish Highlands. On the short journey back to the farm, John felt compelled to continuously glance over his shoulder where the hill had convinced that was professional instincts that were telling him to investigate him more closely. After some annoying persistence of Farmer Dale, he eventually surrendered his silence and spoke briefly on the subject, with obvious disdain for the unusual landmark. When he asked who owned it, even perhaps Dale himself was the landlord, but there were no mere mention of this farmer, scoff only saying, no one owns that place, and no one goes there neither. He would prefer not to say much else, but before then, John departed for the inn, and the farmer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and advising him to leave the hill alone. It was a dangerous one, and he hoped that he would never have to speak about it again. While Dale seemed to fear any mention of it, the overriding impression conveyed was the old man was dominated by a profound sadness, one to which it was best left alone. As much as he was fascinated by the farmer's warnings, it was not the first time that John had encountered local superstitions, ones which, of course, never listened to. Otherwise, he might have just lost it on a few good pieces of land or property throughout the years. The stories the locals would entertain him was always seemed to revolve around older, more remote parts of Britain. In the past, he had been told the tall tales about the abandoned houses, which carried them the stain of some murderous deed, or woods that could not be cut down for fear of what lived in them. But without an exception, nothing untoward had ever happened. There was no solidity into the myths, and while he enjoyed listening to the accounts of the hauntings and strange beings that prowled in the moors and open countryside, he had a little time for them in his little line of work. Such stories were fun as distraction, but beyond the entertainment around the campfire, they served little purpose. Returning to the inn, he was tired and keen to get out of bed, hoping to conclude any business the following day. But before he could retire to his room, he decided to have a small nightcap at the bar. The landlord seemed a bit unmanageable enough, happy to have someone staying there as the inn's location was often left quite empty, but his friendly demeanor altered drastically at the mention of the hill. Much like Dale, the landlord seemed reluctant to give any detailed information about it, and provided his own words of warning, citing bad ground as a reason to let it be. Whispers and subtle dimensions came from the darkened corners of the room, and the locals seemed to be perturbed by John's questions. No one approached him, but he was well aware of the discomfort. His remark of do you think the hill was haunted was indeed as a joke. Provoked by only silence, the void of sound left John felt was unwelcome. He quickly finished his drink and walked down towards the stairs to his room, but as he did so, a young woman barely made it out of her teens gently touched him on the shoulder and whispered to his ear, "Please don't go to the hill. No one ever comes back." The landlord was within earshot and quickly chastised the girl for even mentioning it, and then turned his back while cleaning up the pint glass, saying in a stuttered tone, "You sleep well, sir. I hope you can conclude your business tomorrow and get back down to London quickly." To John it sounded like a warning rather than a simple good night. The next day he rose early and made his way downstairs to be greeted once more by the landlord, but the man remained relatively quiet, which John felt odd because since he seemed to be quiet and talkative a fellow when he first moved in. Dismissing his host just around another individual adverse to mornings, John grabbed a light breakfast and then made his way back out to the farm to conclude the purchase of Dale's land. As he drove along the quiet country roads, appreciating the impressive landscape, even at the overcast weather, the farm came into view, but in the distance so did the hill. He thought that it seemed a little more prevalent than imposing than the day before, which a crooked structure leaning towards the village in the distance, but quickly shook those feelings from his mind, regarding them as late after side effects of the townsfolk and their superstitious behavior. And yet here he was talking about that place. Only within a few administrative duties left to perform, John was hopeful that he'd be finished by noon and it could make the long 7 to 8 hour drive back to London, finishing up some loose ends before taking part in his usual routine. On desk his apartment sat a 30-year-old bottle of Ballavine malt whiskey, which he would pour a glass from either compelling an important deal. This would be accompanied by a cigarette or two. The only time he smoked, he couldn't trust himself and not to succumb to the habit. A takeaway meal and the next day off to work as he pleased. There were some times where he enjoyed the most of the conclusion of the deal of a little break before and once again being sent to another remote corner of the British Isles. Sitting on Farmer Dale's cottage, John enjoyed the coziness of the place and its acquainted decorations, which reminded him of his grandmother's house as a child. Many things her facing were original, and he was certain that much of the house he must have stemmed back countless generations. Dale himself seemed more pleasant mood than the day before, making a guest cup of tea and a sandwich while John prepared the last of the paperwork. As the old farmer pottered around the kettle with a pair of cups in hand, John glanced over into a nearby window, noticing that the house itself was looking outwards towards the nameless hill a few miles away. Without thinking, he mentioned it casually, for those at the inn seemed very wary of it too. On getting John his tea, Dale sat down on the opposite side of the kitchen table, stirring up his cup thoughtfully. There was another silence, similar to that one of the evening before, despite the cozy surroundings. John once again felt uncomfortable, then eventually that unsettling feeling to give way to annoyance. Why should you not be simply ask as to why people were so afraid of it? These were just superstitions, and they were madness to think that the modern age people could still be swayed so easily to simple stories. After toying with the idea of remaining quiet, John finally broke the silence. Mr. Dale, I don't mean to be rude, but ever since I arrived in the village, people seem to be acting strangely around that hill, and they treat me like I've committed a crime just mentioning it. Perhaps you did, he's replied. Perhaps you shouldn't have mentioned it at all, son. With all due respect, I just want you to know who owned it, as I thought it would be a pretty good idea for the area. What an exciting property development. Property development, Mr. Dale scoffed. The only thing that should be done with that place is the ground is to be sowed with salt. It's just a hill. Just a hill? The old farmer trailed off for a moment, looking off in the windows onwards towards the uncomfortable subject of their discussion. Mr. Dale, John said, his time growing softly, I have been to many scenic locations around the UK, and I know some areas that have stories. They have got bad name or just seem a little frightening. But in my experience, I have never come across any of them that couldn't be put down into simple superstition. I'll even prove it. Prove what, lad? Mr. Dale suddenly apprehensive. I fancy a stroll before and head back down to London. I think I'll take a look. Standing up abruptly, the farmer appeared over now more anxious than angry. His upper lip quivered as he had the appearance of a man who had been hiding a destructive amount of stress from the outside world, just wanting to be vented. You mustn't go there! Please, Mr. Dale, I didn't mean to offend you. John's thoughts were now turned back at the deal at hand, and with nothing signed yet, he did not wish to jeopardize it with his curiosity. How could he explain that to his client? The older man slumped back down on his seat, his gaze over as if fighting a losing battle with an onslaught of terrible memories. I lost my son to that place, he said, trailing off. Oh God, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Dale. Please accept my apologies. Let's just forget about the whole thing. No, it's not your fault. The old farmer smiled across the table with a sorrowful countenance. No one talks about my boy. I'm not allowed to. The locals think I'm just speaking about him when the others will somehow bring more misery down to the village. After a brief pause of contemplation, he broke down, saying, He was a good lad, but we're not built to lose our children. Oh, God! Burying his head in his hands, he began sobbing uncontrollably. John did not know what to say. He could only offer, I'm sorry. Is there anything I could do? Wiping the tears from his eyes, Dale sat back on his chair mournfully. After taking a few deep breaths, he composed himself and then he spoke, his voice quivering and held back emotion. No one knows when it started, and no one knows why. What started? John asked, his passion now overpowered by his curiosity. I grew up in this village, and even when I was a boy, people didn't have a clue. Sure, they talked about old stories about the dispute between two powerful families, which went back hundreds of years. Dale leaned forward, scratching the graying stubble on his chin before continuing. But no one knows their names, and at least no one who is willing to talk about the hill. The deeds on the land are probably sitting in some solitary's life outside of the living owner, of the high life somewhere unaware of the price we've all paid. Surely there must be a record of the owners. I'm sure there is, lad, but you won't find anyone around here who wants to know. Over the years, the odd person would just ignore the warnings and venture up there. Normally, kids, daring ones, or another, would have to go, but they all never came back. Dale shuffled in his seat uncomfortably as tears began to fill his eyes once more. My boy, he didn't listen. And just like the others, he went up, and then he was gone. Surely you went after him? Asked John in disbelief. Yes, I did try to go up there, but was broken by my grief as my wife and the other children were. They pulled me back from the foot of the hill. They knew it would take me too. So your own son could have been up there hurt, dying, and you didn't go after him all because of the stupid superstition? The idea that myths and lies could have resulted in a young boy's death enraged John, yet he felt ashamed of himself as his own words left his mouth. Dale suddenly flew across the table, grabbing his now unwelcome guest by the collar, battering him with an old stove. Do you think who you're talking to? Dale screamed, his voice shaking John to his core. For an old man, he was sure as strong as an ox. For a brief moment, he thought that the farmer was going to hit him, but then as quickly as he could, Dale replenished his grips while turning his back. When you have 3 other children to feed and a wife who could be heartbroken, you think twice before going up there too. Besides, a few of my boys from the village helped my wife too, while no one would let me go, not because they cared about me, well maybe some did, but mainly because they live in constant fear of the place of what's up there. It might come down and pay us all a visit. Straightening a chair, the old farmer scribbled a signature on the remaining papers, and then asked John to leave, to which he did after offering his apologies once more. At the door both men gave their polite goodbyes, with Dale simply adding, There's an old saying around here, best to leave alone. You'd be wise to listen to it. Despite being shooken by the old farmer's volatility and reaction to his inquiries, John was still certain that he wanted to visit the hill, knowing that those in the village would try and dissuade or even physically restrain him from doing so, as he resulted in driving there immediately from the farm. As he got under the way, the thought perhaps some good of it he could break the fear of that place, but it was more of his stubbornness to which now had motivated him. He wanted to prove that he was right, and even if he discovered the piece of land perfect for development of the process, all the better. Getting there was more troublesome than he had first anticipated. While there was still a small country road which led to the foot of the hill, it had been apparently blocked off by villagers, an arrangement of large concrete slabs, red bricks, old wooden posts, and even other discarded materials that had been increasingly dumped at the end of the road, making an entrance by a car a possibility by foot only with a great difficulty. Seeing the very real physical lengths which the locals would go into order to stop anyone from accessing the hill, John felt increasingly impulse to which it reached its peak and then returned to the village to let low down below on how ridiculous they had been. After leaving the car one by one of the blocked off entrances, he climbed over the stack of rubble with some effort, careful not to cut himself on anything which protruded, and then made his way down a long road. For after a moment, he considered what he might find on the hillside was very real and possibility of discovering the grim remains of a previous visitor. The thoughts which momentarily left him questioning his current course of action. The road was just wide enough for a single car, and it obviously had been left with some elements for some time, with large potholes scarring its surface and depots of mud and gravel converting the tarmac in places. As the hill came into view, he was struck by how much larger it appeared than to be had estimated. From a distance, he would have to assume some quick and hike like its peak, but looking at it was an incline arching way from him. He realized that it would probably take around 2 hours to reach to his crest, and then it was to only track down if the footing could be found. Looking at his watch, it was nearly afternoon, but he believed that he still have enough daylight to make it up the top and then back to his car safely. It was then he began to notice some of the strange landmarks were more particular features. It stood quite alone, with no accompanying the hills around it, as if it had been left there in isolation, quarantined from the land itself, and its ascent seemed to be more profoundly crooked and then at a distance. It's formidable, leaning slightly to one side in bizarre fashion, and its surface was covered in sporadic pockets of trees, wild and untamed collections of long grasses, a tangle of dead yellow strands, embraced or strangled by the green shoots of the most successful strains, invading all around. Most surprising of all was that there was a man-made path which ran up to the peak, one down which it was delighted to discover. It had been spared on sight with the weary and spindly grass which had consumed everything else. For a moment, John considered what it was all was just a hoax, and that he was the victim of an elaborate joke, as the path looked worn as often as it used, but much more darker than the thought of flirted his irrational sensibilities, that Hill himself was leaning inwards. But of course, in sensing visitors, welcoming them to the unknown destination, he quickly dismissed his notion and continued on. An old gate had blocked the way. It's a wooden, but it's obvious had been subjected to the ravages of Scottish weather from some time. Its surface was practically eaten away by green moss and mold, as it would creak open. John stepped over to the threshold, and the gate closed behind him. A shiver ran up his spine, accompanied by a mild nauseous feeling in his throat. If he had been the superstitious himself, he would have been said that the place was bad, and the air seemed foul. But it was not easily affected by such thoughts. It was more likely that something he had eaten had not agreed with him, rather than the hill itself acting up upon his nerves. Wandering up the path, he attempted to make a good time as possible. The idea of making his way back down at night was not one to be relished. With unsure, unseen footing, and as the afternoon sky was already with a little dimmer it had been seen at the moon, he marched up the hill with intent, excited to take in the view from the top. The incline increased slightly, and with it did so, sporadic nature of his surroundings. The long grass had claimed everything barred the path, and clumps of trees occasionally flanked them. Now he could appreciate the locals had come to fear such a place. The reeds of the dead grass and ivy encircling each trunk, suggesting the malevolent purpose. Some of the trees had even fallen over, taking the unusual positions at the steep angles, appearing as if they had been pulled into the earth, broken by the fingers of grass to which had clung to the husks of wood, like any other real levitation. But it was a while was beneficial. Somehow, the hillside did indeed felt wrong, unnatural in places. As John ascended to it, a coldness began to creep under his arms. He had hiked before, and in his job had often been required to be the brave of the wilderness while evaluating the land. But this was different. It was as if the land was affecting the temperature, rather than the weather, making it increasingly difficult to ignore the oppressive atmosphere of the hill. Stopping for a moment, he rubbed his arms hesitantly to keep them warm, pausing to apprehend his progress. He was so astonished by how far he had actually climbed, and he had actually been walking no more than 20 minutes. But looking in the direction he had came from, he must have been at least halfway up the hillside. But how could he be? At every evaluation of the hill's size, it seemed to confound the previous conclusion. It was as if the place was warped somehow. John laughed at himself at being so swept up in the impression of his surroundings. Yet the silence bothered him. No birds, no rustling bushes filled with rabbits, foxes, or insects. Indeed, the entire hillside felt dead. No, not dead, he thought, but the grips of death itself it was. However, the winter was so perhaps he would have expected the seemingly sterility of the countryside. But the quiet still perturbed him. Then another unusual phenomenon came to his attention. An inconsistency. Something had contracted his own memory. His very faculties. The path behind was now different. While climbing, John had been amazed on how overgrown the hillside was compared to the track leading upwards. This led him to suspect that everything perhaps used regularly, but looking down on the hill, it was now appeared to be engulfed in by the wandering hands of nature. Perhaps not completely, but certainly not certain far greater degree than it had been before. The grass swept over it, while the bushes and trees leaned against a nearby, suggesting more rugged terrain than he had intentionally noticed. Yet the path left ahead lay clear. Looking into the world outside down below, everything appeared distant somehow, almost significantly in appearance. The colors were not as vivid, as the meadows were very populated and the valleys had foregone their vibrancy. The sky itself had filtered down towards the ground with what John could only describe as a false light. He struggled to dismiss the unwelcome feeling that he was experiencing, and while he continued for a short time, he climbed on from the nausea from when he had first stepped on foot onto the hill had returned. The cold sensation, which had enveloped his extremities, had progressed like a disease, penetrating his insides and had chilling him to the bone. John had tried his best to reach the peak, but he was a fool. He knew that not a month had passed without a report of the news about an inexperienced walker or climber going missing on a remote mountain. And while the hill was seemingly be more of a retrospect, he was now willing to accept defeat, even welcoming it. The surroundings melted menacingly, and his current physical condition was enough to cause retreat. Though he cannot have reached the summit, John had decided that if he still made it back to the village after being on the hillside, that would be enough to dispute their superstitions. Perhaps he would return in the summer to evaluate the land, considering the decision to be postponed rather than an admission of a failure. Entertaining the notion, and the locals may have been right all along, and was not something he wished to do. There would have to be some evidence of his adventure, of course, taking out his pocket a camera phone, which he had used to document his work. John began to shiver as once again icy sensation crept up through his arms, provoking the desire to be warmed by the fire back within the inn. With a few article clicks, he photographed all around the surrounding hill, and then as a joke took a picture of himself, forcing a smile with a triangle of grass and trees as a backdrop. What he saw next when he viewed the pictures sent chills through his body. The first few photographs of the area turned out as expected, but the last betrayed something along the bushes behind him. What looked like a building of some description. At the forefront of John's mind, he was filled with an impulse to run, to leave that place. But he was fascinated by the idea of a hidden construction removed from the outside world by a barrier of leaf or branch and a legend. Taking a deep breath, he crept quietly through the gusted grass, pulling up the leaves of a large, low-hanging trees to the side. There, sitting on the hillside, were what the locals feared to trade. What looked like an old chapel or church. One small steeple reached up towards the sky, with the large stained glass windows, many of which were broken, dotted with the shell of gray stone building. Speaking of days of more prompt and glad, John's heart ached at the sight of it. Perhaps maybe there was a reason why the hill had been tarnished with superstition and myth. An old abandoned church, that's certainly fertile foundation, or frightening tales. Yet the church itself could not banish his own feelings of caution. As he broke through the layer of leaves, grass, and climbing ivy, he could not help but respond to his nerves. Sweat had begun to drip down from his face, while his heart pumped blood with unsettling, unstable rhythm. Leaving the hill with his intention, but as he drew closer to the stone archway, then he sheltered under the church door within it. He surmised that the locals will be more open to this conventional explanation of why people fear the place. If they knew what happened inside, without seeing the interior of the church, the villagers would once again spin stories and falsehoods about what remained hidden. The door was a dark brown oak with scratched decorative black strips adorning the surface, but unfortunately it seemed locked. John gave it a few solid shoves with his hand, and then surprisingly, With a groan of countless years, it creaked open slightly, creating a space just big enough for him to slide through it. Peering through the gap, he could see that the church floor was covered in fallen masonry from the roof above. A large collection of stones lay piled up behind the door. Their collective weight had held it shut, and although they have given away that part, they still provided enough to resistance to stop it from opening it completely. Cold, musty air escaped from the inside, smelling stale as stone long since abandonment. For a moment, John considered what he should do. Such an old banding left to rot for decades, if not centuries. Could it provide dangerous? But desire still burnt up deep within him to prove that he had barely been seen all that what could be seen, and that there were no ghosts or ghouls here, only fragments of the forgotten history. Taking out his phone, he poked his hand through the gap of the door, took a few photographs with the flash. The light lit up to the entire hall inside, showing it to be filled with rubble from obviously failing roof. But at the back of the room, where lay what appeared to be an altar of some kind, from his vantage point, it looked to be some made of stone, resting on a raised step, several feet high above it. John was thrilled by the presence of inscription of some kind that carved the back of the wall, but unfortunately he could not picture of the lettering from the doorway. Sighing, he knew that the only way left to read it would be to go inside. The concern of being injured or trapped by anything falling above was paramount, but his curiosity was now filled with flight, and his enthusiasm quivering both sickness in his stomach and the icy numbing of his extremities.